Have you ever poured your entire being into someone you cherish, only to find out they view you as little more than a weight to be cast off? Our account today centers on Arthur Vance, a 70-year-old nurse who made the greatest sacrifice on his own birthday, enduring a punishing 24-hour shift to rescue his son from his financial troubles. But upon returning home, weary and despondent, he overheard a discussion that would irrevocably alter his path. His son, Leo, and his wife were making arrangements to place him in a care facility the instant he settled their last bill. "We need to get our own lives back," they reasoned, as though Arthur's own life held no significance. What unfolded next is truly astonishing, because Arthur didn't challenge them, he didn't weep, and he didn't plead. He just disappeared. And when his son finally located him 2 years down the line, he learned that the frail, elderly man he believed he could manipulate had transformed into someone he could never have anticipated. This is more than just a tale of betrayal. It's the story of a man who discovered that sometimes the most decisive action you can take is to vanish and reconstruct your life according to your own principles. If you've ever felt overlooked, used, or dismissed due to your age, Arthur's metamorphosis will serve as an inspiration and prove that it's never too late to take back your own power. So, get comfortable, because this narrative will serve as a potent reminder that underestimating a resolute man is a profound error. At 70 years of age, I should have been celebrating over a birthday cake, not punching the clock for another exhausting 24-hour duty at Sunset Manor. Yet, there I was, combing my silver hair back and affixing my name tag to my uniform, Arthur Vance, licensed practical nurse. The cruel irony was not lost on me. I was dedicating my birthday to looking after individuals my own age, and some even younger, who had the means for professional care, while I worked myself to the bone just to keep my own family from sinking. "Happy birthday, Arthur," called out Simon, the day shift manager, as I logged my arrival. 70 years young today, aren't you? You don't look a day past 55. I managed to smile and offered my thanks, although the kind words felt empty. It was true. I had been fortunate with good genes. Clear skin that had endured 70 years with a certain grace, bright blue eyes that hadn't lost their spark, and the kind of silver hair people often compared to spun moonlight. But what value was there in looking youthful when I felt a deep, weary ancientness within? My phone vibrated. It was a message from my son, Leo. "Thanks for taking the extra shift, Dad. This is a huge help with the mortgage payment. Love you." A full 24 hours. That was the commitment I'd made so my 45-year-old son could make his house payment without delay. Again. This had been our pattern for 3 years, ever since Leo's construction business began to falter. It started with a small loan now and then. Soon, it escalated to regular assistance with bills, groceries, and car payments. And now, at 70, I was pulling double shifts, my arthritic hands throbbing as I helped patients, and my back protesting with every stoop to change a set of bed linens. But he was my son, my only child. The little boy I raised by myself after his mother Eleanor passed away in a car accident when Leo was just 8 years old. I had given up everything for him. My own continued education, my aspirations of seeing the world, any chance at finding companionship again. How could I possibly refuse him now, in his time of need? Mr. Henderson in room 12 was experiencing one of his restless nights, thoroughly convinced his long-departed wife was arriving to take him dancing. I dedicated an hour to sitting with him, holding his fragile, paper-thin hand, and listening to his tales of their courtship in the 1950s. There was a poignant beauty in the way love could endure, even as memory faded. "You're such a patient listener, my friend," he remarked, his hazy eyes suddenly focusing on me with startling clarity. "Do you have someone special in your life?" I considered it. Did I? My son rarely called unless it was about money. My daughter-in-law, Chloe, had never truly accepted me, regarding me more as an inconvenient duty than as family. I had colleagues at work, but no one I could call a true friend. When had my entire world shrunk to such a small compass? "I have my son," I answered at last. Mr. Henderson gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "That's wonderful, my friend. But what about someone for you? Someone who truly sees you for who you are?" That question followed me throughout the long night shift. As I assisted Mrs. Gable to the restroom at 3 a.m. and dispensed medications at 6 a.m., I couldn't stop wondering when I had transitioned from being Arthur to simply being Leo's father, or the man who helps out. Morning finally broke, and Simon arrived to take over. My feet were swollen. A fire raged in my lower back, and I was steeped in that profound, bone-deep fatigue that only comes from being upright for 24 consecutive hours. But Leo's mortgage would be paid, and that was the important thing, or so I kept telling myself. I drove back to the little apartment I was renting on the edge of town, a stark contrast to the lovely house I had sold 5 years earlier to help Leo with the startup capital for his business. The apartment was tidy but minimally furnished, filled with items I had gathered from thrift shops and garage sales. At 70, my living situation mirrored that of a university student. As I steered into the parking area, I noticed Leo's truck parked in my designated spot. My spirits lifted slightly. Perhaps he had come to express his gratitude in person, or even better, to spend some quality time with his father on his birthday. I ascended the stairs to my second-floor unit, key in hand, but paused as I heard voices coming through the flimsy door. Leo was inside, certainly, but Chloe was with him, and their conversation was about me. "We can't keep this up indefinitely," Chloe was saying. "He's 70 years old, Leo. How much longer do you think he can work these insane shifts just to rescue us?" I'm aware," Leo answered. "But what other option do we have? The business is finally starting to show signs of life, but we need another 6 months, perhaps a year, to be truly stable. And after that, he'll be 71, working himself into an early grave because you can't handle your finances." There was a brief silence, and then Leo's voice became quieter. I leaned my ear against the door. "Listen, as soon as he's finished covering our debts and we're secure again, we'll arrange something. Maybe it's time we started researching nursing homes. Good ones, but affordable. He can't live on his own forever, and frankly, we need our lives back. We have to consider our own future, our own retirement." My blood felt like it had turned to ice. A nursing home. Chloe's response was measured, not shocked. "I suppose that is logical. He wouldn't have to work anymore, and we could stop feeling so guilty about asking for his help all the time." "Precisely. And let's be real. He isn't getting any younger. It's better to manage the transition now, while he's still in relatively good health, rather than waiting for a medical emergency." I stood motionless in the corridor, my key frozen in mid-air, as my son and his wife orchestrated my disposal as if I were a cumbersome piece of furniture they were tired of hauling around. "So, how do you think he'll react to it?" Chloe inquired. Leo chuckled, a sound that pierced my heart like a shard of glass. "Dad has always been eager to please. He'll likely talk himself into believing it's for the best. And truthfully, it will be a major relief for everyone. He can find friends his own age, play cards, do whatever it is old people do. We can visit him on the weekends." Weekends. As if I were a distant uncle they felt a recurring obligation to check on. I retreated from the door, my hands trembling so violently, I almost fumbled my keys. 24 hours. I had just worked for 24 hours on my 70th birthday so that my son could pay his mortgage. And this was his form of repayment. Not with thankfulness, but with a strategy to store me away in some budget facility where I could play cards until my time was up. I managed to get back down the stairs and into my car before the tears began to fall. 47 years of self-denial. 47 years of prioritizing Leo, ensuring he had everything he could possibly need, even when it left me with nothing. And this was my reward. I sat in my car and wept until I was empty of tears. Then I dried my face, started the car, and drove away. I had no destination in mind, but I knew I could not go back through that door. I couldn't act as though I hadn't heard what I had just heard. As I drove through the town that had been my home for most of my adult life, a realization dawned on me that should have been frightening, but instead felt strangely liberating. My son had no real knowledge of who I was. He saw Arthur, the provider, Arthur, the problem fixer, Arthur, the man who always said yes. He was completely unaware of the investments I had discreetly built over the years, the life insurance policy from his mother that I'd never spoken of, or the small inheritance from my uncle that I had never disclosed to him. Leo believed he was charting out my future, but perhaps it was time for me to start charting out his. Have you ever been made to feel like a ghost in your own family? Depleted, and then set aside once you were no longer of use? Arthur's story is only just getting started, and believe me, the events that follow will leave you stunned. If you've ever been told you're too old for a fresh start, allow me to state that it is a falsehood. Your narrative isn't finished, and you have more chapters to compose. It's a reminder for anyone listening that a new beginning is always possible. Arthur's quiet revenge is about to commence in a manner that will leave you utterly astounded. Sometimes, the most unassuming people hold the most shocking secrets. For 2 hours, I drove without a destination, my thoughts replaying every single word I'd overheard through that door. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set as I finally eased into a parking space at Riverside Park, a place I frequently brought Leo to when he was a little boy. The bitter irony was not lost on me. Here I was, at the very spot where I had spent innumerable hours pushing him on the swings and tending to his scraped knees, while he was now planning to push me completely out of his life. My phone had been buzzing incessantly with texts from Leo. "Dad, where are you? Your car's not here. I'm getting worried. Call me. Seriously, Dad, where did you go?" The apparent concern in his messages might have moved me yesterday. Today, it felt like nothing more than an exercise in managing his own guilt. He was worried I might have overheard them, or even worse, that I had collapsed somewhere, creating an unwelcome problem for him. I powered down my phone and sat on a bench facing the river, observing the ducks as they paddled in slow, unhurried circles. An elderly gentleman was tossing them pieces of bread from a paper bag, utterly lost in the simple joy of the moment. When was the last time I had experienced that kind of tranquility? The truth is, Leo's betrayal should not have been a surprise. The warning signs had been present for years. The way he had begun to view my assistance as an entitlement instead of a gift. The dismissive way Chloe would roll her eyes whenever I offered a piece of advice. The way they would converse around me rather than with me during family get-togethers. I had become their personal financial institution and errand runner combined, except I was the one providing everything and receiving nothing in return but the honor of working myself to exhaustion for their comfort. A woman, likely in her 60s, jogged by, looking fit and full of life in her athletic attire. She smiled and waved, and I couldn't help but wonder about her life. Did she have children who perceived her as a liability? Or had she succeeded in preserving her own identity, her own sense of self-worth beyond what she could offer to others? As dusk settled, I knew I would have to go home at some point. But as I pulled back into my parking space, Leo's truck was, thankfully, gone. I felt as though I was returning a fundamentally different person from the one who had left that morning. I climbed those stairs once more, but this time there were no tears. This time I was strategizing. My apartment seemed different now, as if I were observing it with a fresh pair of eyes. The second-hand furniture, the generic wall art, the minimal decorations, it all appeared as what it truly was, the living space of someone who had ceased to believe in himself. But I hadn't given up on myself. I had simply forgotten the man I was beneath the layers of constant giving. I brewed a cup of tea and sat down at my small kitchen table with a notepad. I wrote a heading at the top of the page. What do you mean, your life is here with us, with me? The ownership in his tone was stark. Not, your life is with people who love you, but with us, as if I were property rather than a person. Leo, I have dedicated 47 years to putting your needs above my own. I believe it's time I prioritized mine for a change. But I need you, Dad. The business is finally gaining momentum, but I still require your help for a couple more months. There it was. Not, I miss you, or I'm concerned about you, but I need your help. Even in his desperation, Leo was incapable of seeing me as anything other than a utility. Leo, I overheard you and Chloe discussing the nursing home, about getting your lives back after I've finished paying off your debts. The silence on the other end was so prolonged I thought the connection had been lost. Dad, that wasn't... We were just brainstorming hypothetically about the future. Were you? Because it sounded as though you had formulated some rather concrete plans. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was stressed about our finances and I said things I didn't mean. You know I love you. I know you believe you do. But Leo, love isn't merely a sentiment. It is demonstrated by how you treat people. And for many years now, you have treated me like a problem that needs to be managed, not a person to be cherished. Another long pause. What can I do to make this right? He finally asked, and in his voice I heard a faint echo of the little boy he once was. You can learn to handle your own problems. You can construct a life that isn't reliant on your 70-year-old father working himself to death to finance it. You can finally grow up, Leo. But what about us? What about our family? We will always be family. But the dynamic we had before, the one where I provide and you receive, that is finished. When you are prepared to engage in an adult relationship with me, one founded on mutual respect rather than financial reliance, then you can call me. I ended the call before he had a chance to reply. My hands were shaking, but I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in Leo's adult life, I had confronted him with the reality of our relationship instead of perpetuating his delusions. The days that followed were filled with a barrage of messages. Leo's efforts to bargain, to pledge changes he had no real intention of making, to guilt me into reverting to my old role. I read every one of them, but did not reply. Instead, I immersed myself in my new existence with growing excitement. I joined Samuel's book club and found that I held strong views on contemporary literature. I began attending watercolor workshops at the community center and discovered a natural talent for color and form. Most unexpectedly, I started spending more time with Sarah. What began as casual walks had blossomed into deeper conversations over coffee, collaborative dinners, and an effortless companionship that I hadn't known in decades. You're truly coming into your own, she commented one evening as we watched the sun set from the cottage deck. When we first met, you seemed to be carrying the weight of the entire world. Now, you look like someone who has learned how to set it down." She was right. The perpetual knot of tension in my shoulders had dissolved. The worry lines around my eyes were beginning to soften. Even my posture felt different, more upright, more self-assured. I was discovering what it meant to live for myself. And it was an exhilarating feeling. 1 month after my disappearance, I made a choice that would have seemed unimaginable back when I was working double shifts to cover Leo's expenses. I formally retired from Sunset Manor. Simon was sad to see me go, but was understanding. "You've earned this," he said when I called to submit my notice. "Enjoy your retirement, Arthur. You've worked hard enough for several lifetimes." That afternoon, I sat on the dock with a glass of wine, observing the light dance on the water's surface, and was amazed by how profoundly my life had shifted in just 30 days. I was no longer Arthur the provider, Arthur the problem fixer, Arthur, the man who always said yes. I was simply Arthur, a man with his own passions, his own friends, his own decisions. A man who was learning at 70 what it truly meant to be alive. Leo thought I had vanished, but the reality was simpler and far more significant. I had finally emerged. After decades of shaping my identity through my service to others, I was discovering who Arthur Vance truly was when he wasn't occupied with being indispensable to everyone else. And I was beginning to like him very much. The cottage's peaceful isolation provided me with the space to think, and that thinking led to remembering. As I sat near the fireplace that evening, a warm mug of hot chocolate in my hands, the memories returned in a torrent. Not the polished, edited versions I typically allowed myself to recall, but the stark, unembellished truth of all I had relinquished for Leo. I was 25 when Eleanor died. A tragic accident on the highway. A collision that stole my wife and left me with an 8-year-old son and a mountain of unforeseen expenses. The life insurance was barely enough to cover Eleanor's funeral and the hospital bills from her final 3 days in intensive care. I had been a nurse for only 2 years at that point, still establishing my career, still in the process of learning. But in an instant, I became the sole provider for a grieving child who was plagued by nightmares and couldn't grasp why his mommy wasn't coming home. The initial sacrifice was my continuing education. I had been attending night classes to earn my bachelor's degree in nursing, with dreams of one day becoming a nurse practitioner. But caught between my job and Leo's needs, something had to be sacrificed. I withdrew from my classes and concentrated on advancing my career with just my LPN license. "It's temporary," I assured myself. "I'll return to it when Leo is older." But Leo's needs only continued to expand. Baseball gear, school materials, clothes he seemed to outgrow every 6 months. Then, the larger expenses arrived. Braces for his teeth, glasses for his nearsightedness, a tutor when he had trouble with algebra. I took on extra shifts, worked through holidays, and picked up weekend hours at a local clinic. While other parents were in the audience at their children's school events, I was usually at work, earning the money to pay for Leo's class excursions. When Leo turned 16, he wanted a vehicle. Not just any vehicle, but a pickup truck like his friend Michael's. "All the popular kids have trucks, Dad," he had pleaded, and I had been swayed by the look of hope in his eyes. I liquidated my small retirement fund to purchase that truck for him, telling myself that his happiness was a greater asset than my own future financial stability. College was the next major step, and it brought another heart-wrenching decision. I had been saving for years, putting aside every extra dollar I could for Leo's higher education. But when he was accepted into the state university, my savings were not enough. Without a moment's hesitation, I took out a second mortgage on our house, the home Eleanor and I had purchased as newlyweds. "Don't stress about the money, Dad," Leo had said, giving me a brief hug before he left for his orientation week. I'll make it up to you one day. That day never arrived. Leo switched his major 3 times, extending his 4-year degree into a 6-year journey. Each additional semester brought more costs for tuition, housing, books, and fees. I worked double shifts relentlessly to manage the payments, my body aging under the constant strain. When he finally graduated with a business degree, I was so overcome with pride that I wept at the ceremony. My son, the first in our family to earn a college degree. Surely, all those sacrifices had been worthwhile. Or so I believed. Leo moved back home for a little while as he searched for a job. For a little while stretched into 2 years. He had high standards, he explained. He wasn't going to accept just any position. He was looking for a role that was commensurate with his education and his potential. In the meantime, I was covering his car insurance, his cell phone bill, and his lingering credit card debt from his college days. The second mortgage was a crushing weight, but Leo needed this time to figure things out. When he announced his plan to start his own construction company, I felt a mix of terror and immense pride. He had a grand vision, he said. He was going to create more than just a job. He was going to build a legacy. The initial costs were immense. Leo required equipment, a work truck, insurance, various permits, and operating funds. He presented his business plan with such unwavering confidence that I, too, began to believe in his dream. I sold our family home, the house where I had raised him, the place where Eleanor and I had envisioned growing old together, and I gave Leo the majority of the proceeds. This is an investment in our future, he had promised. Once the company is successful, you'll never have to work another day in your life. The company struggled right from the start. Leo was skilled with his hands, but inept with finances. He consistently underbid on jobs, overpaid his employees, and purchased equipment he couldn't afford. Every few months brought a new crisis that demanded my intervention. I moved into my small apartment and began taking on even more shifts at the hospital. Leo moved in with Chloe, a woman he had met at a business networking event. She was attractive and ambitious, and she treated Leo as if he were already the successful entrepreneur he aspired to be. Their wedding was a modest affair. Leo said they preferred something intimate, but I knew it was because they couldn't afford a larger celebration. I covered the cost of the reception anyway, using the inheritance from my Uncle Raymond that I had been saving for emergencies. "Thanks, Dad," Leo had said as he danced with his new bride. "You're the best." I watched them together, feeling a complicated blend of emotions, joy for his happiness, pride in the man he had become, and a creeping anxiety about my own future. At 65, I was still working full-time to finance my married son's business ambitions. This pattern persisted for another 5 years. Each time Leo's company hit a rough patch, I was there with another loan, another cash infusion, another solution. I convinced myself that I was helping him build something lasting, something that would ultimately provide security for both of us. But now, sitting in Uncle Raymond's cottage, and looking back with newfound clarity, I could finally see the truth I had been so desperately avoiding. Leo had never learned to stand on his own 2 feet because I had never let him. Every time he was about to face the repercussions of his poor choices, I had intervened to rescue him. I had manufactured a 45-year-old man who still relied on his father to fix his problems. The most painful part wasn't the money I had given him, though the sum was considerable. The most painful part was the realization that my love had in a way disabled him. By perpetually being his safety net, I had prevented him from ever learning how to soar on his own. And now, in return for my decades of sacrifice, my reward was a plan for my own disposal. Once I had settled his debts, I was to be dispatched to a nursing home, where I could play cards and be visited on weekends like a distant relative. I gazed into the fire, watching the logs crackle and glow, and I felt a fundamental shift within me. For 47 years, my identity had been defined by what I could provide for Leo. Now, it was time to find out what I could provide for myself. The grieving young widower who had given up everything for his son was no more. In his place stood a 70-year-old man with resources, intelligence, and for the first time in decades, no one to look after but himself. The feeling was both daunting and electrifying. Tomorrow, I would begin constructing a life that was truly my own. Tonight, I would mourn the years I had lost and start planning how to make the ones I had left truly matter. Leo thought he had been planning my future, but I was about to demonstrate that underestimating Arthur Vance was the most significant mistake he had ever made. 3 days into my retreat at the cottage, Leo's desperation had escalated dramatically. My phone, which I now only checked once per day, was inundated with a flood of increasingly agitated messages. He had cycled through annoyance, then worry, and was now bordering on full-blown panic. "Dad, this isn't funny. Where are you?" "I went by Sunset Manor. They said you took vacation time. Why wouldn't you tell me?" "Chloe thinks you might be having some kind of mental breakdown. Are you okay? I've called every hospital within a 50-mile radius. Please just send a text so I know you're alive." The expressed concern might have resonated with me if I hadn't overheard him plotting my exile just 4 days prior. Now, it felt like what it truly was: fear that his financial lifeline had abruptly vanished. In the solitude of the cottage, I was making discoveries about myself. For one, I was an exceptional cook when I had the time to properly plan a meal, rather than just grabbing whatever was fast in between shifts. I had baked homemade bread the day before, filling the cottage with the kind of warm, comforting aroma I associated with my own childhood. I was also realizing how much I savored silence, true silence, not the exhausted collapse into bed after a 16-hour workday. This was a peaceful, rejuvenating quiet that allowed me to hear my own thoughts clearly for the first time in what felt like an eternity. On the 4th morning, I walked down to the lake's edge and sat on the small dock that Uncle Raymond had constructed decades ago. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the surrounding pine trees with the clarity of a mirror. A loon's haunting call echoed across the lake from a distant shore. It was in that moment, watching tiny minnows dart through the shallows, that I made my firm decision. I was not returning to my former life, not to the apartment where I was living like a college student, not to the job that was working me into the ground, and not to the role of being Leo's personal bank. I was 70 years old, and for the first time since Eleanor passed away, I was going to live for myself. That afternoon, I drove into Pine Ridge, the small town closest to the lake. It was exactly the kind of place I had always envisioned for retirement. Tree-lined streets, a main avenue filled with local businesses instead of large chain stores, and people who moved at a relaxed human rhythm instead of rushing frantically from one task to the next. I stopped for lunch at the local diner and started a conversation with Henry, the waiter, who looked like he had been serving there since the 1970s. He was intrigued about the cottage. Apparently, Uncle Raymond had been a bit of a local celebrity. "Raymond Vance was quite the character," Henry said, topping off my coffee. "He moved up here from the city after his wife died, fixed up that cottage all by himself, learned how to fish, cultivated a garden, and wrote letters to the local newspaper about everything from road repairs to wildlife conservation. He lived his life exactly as he wanted to, right up to his last day." "He sounds like an extraordinary man," I remarked. "Oh, he was as independent as they come. He used to say that too many people waste their lives waiting for someone else to give them permission to be happy. Henry looked at me closely. You have a resemblance to him, you know. You have the same eyes. I mulled that over on my drive, back to the cottage, waiting for permission to be happy. For how long had I been doing just that? Waiting for Leo to become successful enough that I could finally stop supporting him. Waiting for some distant, magical future where I would have finally earned the right to consider my own needs. Raymond hadn't waited for permission. He had simply seized his happiness with his own two hands. That evening, I finally replied to Leo's string of messages, not with lengthy explanations or apologies, but with a concise text. I am safe. I need more time. Please do not try to find me. His reply was instantaneous. Dad, please call me. I don't understand what's happening. Did I do something? Whatever is wrong, we can work it out. I looked at the message for a long time. A part of me, the part that had spent 47 years prioritizing Leo, wanted to call him, to ease his anxiety, to make everything right again. But then I recalled Henry's words about Uncle Raymond living his life exactly as he chose, and I powered off the phone instead. The following morning, I returned to town and began to implement changes. Real changes? Not the hesitant, half-hearted steps I had been considering. My first stop was the Pine Ridge Bank, where I opened a new checking account and set up my pension and Social Security to be directly deposited there once they began. The bank manager, a capable man named Jordan, was both helpful and discreet. He didn't inquire why a 70-year-old man was relocating his entire financial life to a small mountain town, and I offered no explanation. My second stop was the post office, where I rented a P.O. box and filled out the forms to have my mail forwarded. Again, no probing questions, just prompt and efficient service. My third stop was the local utility office, where I arranged for full-time electricity, water, and internet service to be connected at the cottage, upgrading from the minimal service Uncle Raymond had maintained. With each completed task, I felt a sense of lightness and growing certainty. This was not a fleeting escape or a grand dramatic gesture. This was me deliberately choosing a life that was mine alone. By the time I got back to the cottage that afternoon, I had been gone for 6 days. Leo's messages had shifted from desperate to angry. Dad, this is cruel. Chloe is worried sick. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it has to end. And then, fine. If you want to pout like a child, be my guest, but don't expect me to keep pleading. That last message nearly made me laugh out loud. Leo was attempting to guilt me into returning by accusing me of being childish. The irony was breathtaking. A 45-year-old man who was still financially dependent on his father was calling him childish for taking a week for himself. I spent that evening compiling lists. Things I wanted to accomplish in my remaining years, places I yearned to visit, books I wanted to read, skills I hoped to acquire. The list grew longer than I had anticipated, filled with aspirations I had postponed for so long that I had nearly forgotten they ever existed. I wanted to travel not the short weekend getaways I had taken with Leo when he was young, but real immersive travel. I wanted to experience Italy, to stroll through vineyards in France, to witness the northern lights in Alaska. I wanted to learn new things: photography, watercolor painting, perhaps even how to play the piano. I had always been good with my hands. Maybe I could take up woodworking or pottery. I wanted to cultivate a garden. A real garden, not just the few tomato plants I had managed in containers on my apartment balcony. I dreamed of growing my own vegetables and herbs, maybe even raising a few chickens. Above all, I wanted to wake up each morning and ask myself, what does Arthur want to do today? Instead of, what does Leo need from Arthur today? The realization that all of these things were now within my grasp that I possessed the resources, the health, and finally, the freedom to pursue them was intoxicating. Leo could search for me all he wanted. The man he was searching for, the man who always said yes, who sacrificed his own needs without a second thought, who existed primarily as a solution to problems that man was gone. I was still Arthur Vance, but I was now Arthur Vance for myself, and I was only just beginning. 6 weeks after my departure, Leo's world started to truly come apart. Through my network of old acquaintances, specifically my former neighbor, Mr. Peterson, I was kept informed. Bless his soul, I learned that Leo and Chloe were experiencing their first significant financial crisis without their paternal safety net. The mortgage payment that my birthday shift would have covered had bounced. Leo's business account was overdrawn, and 2 of his employees had quit after their paychecks failed to clear. A key client had terminated their contract after Leo appeared at the job site intoxicated and hostile, having spent the previous evening trying to drink away his problems at a local bar. He stopped by again yesterday. Mr. Peterson informed me during one of our weekly phone calls. He looks awful unshaven, clothes all wrinkled, like he hasn't been sleeping. He asked if I'd heard from you, and when I told him no, he just started crying right there in the hallway. A small part of me felt a pang of pity for him, but it was overshadowed by a growing resentment for his sense of entitlement. Leo was 45 years old, and this was the very first time in his adult life that he had to face the genuine consequences of his poor judgment without me stepping in to rescue him. In contrast, my own life was flourishing in ways I had never thought possible. Sarah and I had become very close, sharing morning walks, afternoon projects around the cottage, and long evening discussions on topics ranging from philosophy and gardening to our mutual appreciation for classic films. I haven't felt this at ease with another person in years, she confessed one evening as we sat by the fireplace, each reading our own book in a comfortable silence. I knew exactly what she meant. With Sarah, there was no pressure. No feeling that I needed to be anyone other than who I was. She enjoyed my company for what it was, without expecting me to solve her problems or finance her ambitions. It was a revelation. Samuel had also become a close friend, introducing me to the other men in his book club, a group of intelligent, independent men who had each built meaningful lives for themselves. Through them, I discovered local hiking trails, artisan markets, and opportunities to volunteer at the animal shelter. For the first time in decades, I had a social life that was entirely separate from Leo's needs or my work commitments. 8 weeks in, Leo's desperation escalated. According to Mr. Peterson, he had been contacting my old landlord, trying to learn if I had terminated my lease. When that proved fruitless, he began calling hospitals and police stations, claiming his elderly father was missing and possibly suffering from dementia. The officer who came by was very professional, Mr. Peterson reported. I assured him you were perfectly clear-headed when we last spoke, and that you had explicitly stated you needed some time away. He seemed to grasp that Leo was more concerned about his own predicament than about yours. A very perceptive officer. Leo's messages had adopted an increasingly desperate plea. Dad, whatever this is about, we can fix it. Please just come home. I'm sorry about the nursing home comment. I was an idiot. I'll never mention it again. The business is collapsing without your help. Please don't let me lose everything Mom and I built. That last message was particularly galling. His mother had built a small, stable life that provided for her family. Leo had transformed it into a financial black hole that had swallowed my life savings and nearly obliterated my retirement. 2 months after my departure, Leo made a move that exposed the true extent of his desperation and entitlement. He hired a private investigator. I found this out from an unexpected source. Sarah. "There was a man in town today asking questions about you," she told me over dinner at my cottage. "He said he was a private investigator, hired by your family to locate you. He asked around at the bank, the grocery store, even the post office. My blood ran cold. What did people tell him? Nothing of any use, from what I can tell. You've been smart about using cash for most things, and the people around here who know you're staying at the cottage are very protective of your privacy." Sarah reached over the table and gently squeezed my hand. "Arthur, do you want to tell me what's really happening? I know it's not my place to ask, but I care about you, and I'm worried." And so, I told her everything. The decades of sacrifice, the conversation I overheard, the plan for my disposal once I had served my purpose. Sarah listened without passing judgment, her expression becoming more and more serious. "That's not love," she said finally. "That's exploitation. You were absolutely right to leave." Her validation meant more to me than I could possibly articulate. For months I had been questioning myself, wondering if I was being too severe, too selfish. Sarah's perspective affirmed what I had known deep down. Leo had crossed a line from which there was no return. The presence of a private investigator in Pine Ridge spurred me to move forward with the next stage of my plan. I had been content to simply live my new life and let Leo sort out his own issues. But his refusal to honor my request for space changed everything. If he was desperate enough to hire a professional to track me down, then it was time for Leo to learn that his father was not the powerless old man he imagined him to be. The next morning, I drove to the bank in Pine Ridge with a very specific objective. I wanted to transfer the bulk of my assets into a trust, one designed to provide for my own needs during my lifetime, and to distribute the remaining funds according to my wishes after my death. This is an irrevocable trust. Jordan, the bank manager, explained as we went through the documents. Once it's created, you cannot alter the beneficiaries or the terms, even if you have a change of heart later on. "I understand," I said, signing each page with a firm hand. "That is precisely what I want." Leo thought he was searching for a confused old man who needed to be brought home for his own safety. What he would eventually find was someone who had used his betrayal as the impetus to secure his own future while completely severing him from it. The private investigator could search to his heart's content. By the time Leo found me, it would be far too late for him to charm or guilt his way back into my good graces or my will. I was no longer the man who had sacrificed everything for his ungrateful son. I was a man with a strategy, with resources, and with the unwavering resolve to see it through. Leo's greed was about to cost him more than he could ever possibly fathom. He just didn't know it yet. The private investigator Leo hired was persistent, but in the end he was unsuccessful. Pine Ridge was the kind of community where newcomers were noticed, and long-standing residents looked out for their own. After 2 weeks of making inquiries and searching records, he departed empty-handed, informing Leo that he had exhausted all possible local leads. I knew this because Leo called me again, his voice strained with desperation. "Dad, I hired someone to find you. I had to know you were safe." "You hired someone to invade my privacy," I corrected him. "There is a significant difference. I don't understand why you're doing this to me. To us. I'm losing everything. The house, the business, my marriage. Chloe is talking about leaving if I can't get our finances in order." 3 months ago, the pleading tone in his voice might have moved me. Now, it only served to emphasize his complete inability to accept responsibility for his own decisions. "Leo, your financial troubles were there long before I left. I was simply concealing them by constantly bailing you out. But you're my father. You're supposed to help your family." I did help you. For 47 years, I put your needs ahead of my own. I worked myself to exhaustion to finance your ambitions. I risked my own retirement security to keep you from failing. And what was my reward for all of that? A plan to store me in a nursing home once I was no longer useful. That was never the actual plan. Leo, I heard what I heard. And more importantly, I learned something crucial about myself. I do not have to tolerate being treated that way. Not by anyone, and not even by my own son. Following that conversation, I decided it was time to take more definitive action to safeguard my future and to send Leo an unmistakable message about consequences. My first visit was to my lawyer's office in Pine Ridge. Marcus Wright was a sharp man in his 60s who specialized in estate planning and elder law. He had come highly recommended by Samuel, and I took an immediate liking to him. I want to completely rewrite my will, I informed him at our initial meeting. My son has demonstrated that he cannot be trusted with financial matters, and I want to ensure that my assets are passed on to people and causes that will use them responsibly. Marcus nodded professionally. That is certainly your prerogative. Do you have particular beneficiaries in mind? I did. In the 3 months since I had left my old life behind, I had connected with people and organizations that had come to mean a great deal to me. Sarah, who had shown me what companionship without exploitation felt like. Samuel and my friends from the book club, who had provided me with a sense of community and purpose. The Pine Ridge Animal Shelter, where I had begun to volunteer. The literacy program at the local library, where I had started tutoring adults who were learning to read. I also want to include some specific conditions, I added. If my son challenges the will or tries to claim undue influence, I want a provision that ensures he receives nothing, not even the small token amount I'm considering leaving him. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's what we refer to as a no-contest clause. It is legally binding in this state. But I must ask, are you certain you want to be that absolute? I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life. In the weeks that followed, I also executed a few strategic financial maneuvers intended to protect my assets and send a clear signal to Leo. I closed the savings account that he was aware of, the one I had referenced during our many financial discussions, and donated the full amount to charity. Specifically, I gave it to the National Association for the Prevention of Elder Financial Abuse, with a note asking that the funds be used for educational programs. The donation was large enough to merit a formal thank you letter, which I had mailed to my old address. I knew Leo would find it as he continued to check my mail, and I wanted him to understand that his father wasn't just hiding. He was actively directing his money to organizations that protect people like me from people like him. I also closed the joint bank account that Leo and I had shared for emergencies, the one he had often used to access my funds without needing to ask permission. The bank statements showing the account closure and a zero balance would communicate the message on their own. But my most significant move was more subtle, and ultimately, far more impactful. Through my volunteer work at the Literacy Center, I had met Julia Hayes, a retired investigative journalist who had moved to Pine Ridge after a notable career. Julia still had connections throughout the media industry, and she was particularly interested in stories concerning elder abuse and financial exploitation. It's a widespread problem, she told me over coffee one afternoon. Adult children who view their aging parents as personal ATMs instead of as people. The stories I could share would shock you. What if someone wanted to share their story publicly? I asked casually, as if posing a hypothetical question. To help others recognize the warning signs. Julia's eyes lit up with professional curiosity. It would depend on the story, but if it's compelling enough, I still have contacts at the state newspaper. They are always on the lookout for human interest pieces that highlight important social issues. Over the next 2 weeks, I carefully wrote out my story, not as Arthur Vance, but as an anonymous case study of financial elder abuse. I altered names and specific details, but the emotional core of the story remained intact. A son who had spent decades taking advantage of his father's love, draining his finances while planning to discard him once he was no longer useful. Julia was captivated by the piece and agreed to present it to her former colleagues. "This is precisely the kind of story that needs to be told," she said. "The writing is compelling, and the situation is, unfortunately, all too common." The article was published 3 weeks later in the Sunday edition of the state's most widely read newspaper, featured in the lifestyle section under the headline, "The Invisible Victims: When Love Becomes Exploitation." It recounted the story of Martin, a 70-year-old retired nurse whose adult son had spent years treating him like a personal bank while planning to place him in a nursing home once his utility had expired. The article detailed the subtle methods of manipulation, the slow erosion of personal boundaries, and the devastating moment when Martin realized he had been enabling his own mistreatment. But the most powerful section was the conclusion. Martin's decision to reclaim his life, cut off all financial support, and build new relationships founded on mutual respect rather than exploitation. I knew Leo would see the article. Nearly everyone in our old town read the Sunday paper, and someone would surely recognize elements of our story, even with the altered details. More importantly, the article was my public declaration of independence. I was not hiding in shame or confusion. I was speaking out about an issue that affects countless older adults, and I was doing so from a position of strength, not victimhood. Leo called me the day after the article was published. "Did you write this?" he demanded, his voice trembling with fury. "This story about Martin, is this supposed to be about us?" "I'm not sure what you're referring to," I replied calmly. "Don't lie to me. Everyone is talking about it. Mr. Peterson asked me if I had seen the article about the son who stole from his father. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? Leo, if you recognize yourself in a story about elder abuse, perhaps you should reflect on why that might be." The conversation ended with him hanging up on me, but I had achieved my objective. The message had been sent, loud and clear. I wasn't just leaving quietly, I was fighting back, and I possessed resources Leo had never even considered. His desperation was about to become very public, and his attempts to paint me as a confused old man were about to backfire on him in a spectacular way. The invisible victim had found his voice, and he was far from finished using it. For months after my departure, Leo's meticulously built life began to crumble in earnest. Without my financial backing, the fractures in his business and marriage grew into irreparable chasms. I learned of his downfall from various sources, which together painted a complete picture of a man who had finally exhausted his supply of people to exploit. Mr. Peterson reported that Leo had lost the house. The bank came and posted foreclosure notices, he told me during one of our calls. He and Chloe had a massive argument right there on the front lawn. She was yelling about how he had deceived her about his father's money, about how she never would have married him if she had known he was essentially penniless. The irony was palpable. Chloe had been more than happy to enjoy the benefits of my financial support when it was readily available, but she jumped ship the moment the resources dried up. I couldn't help but wonder if Leo recognized the parallel to his own treatment of me. Through Samuel's connections, Pine Ridge being the kind of town where information travels quickly, I found out that Leo had attempted to secure a loan by using my cottage as collateral. The bank had promptly informed him that he had no legal entitlement to the property, which had been in Uncle Raymond's name, and was then transferred directly to me. Leo's astonishment upon discovering that I owned a valuable piece of real estate he had never known about was reportedly a sight to behold. He actually told the loan officer that his father was suffering from dementia and had been tricked into illegally transferring the property. Samuel recounted with a hint of amusement. The officer advised him that he might want to speak with a lawyer before leveling such serious allegations. By the 5th month, Leo's business had failed completely. His reputation for being unreliable, coupled with his increasingly erratic behavior, had scared off his few remaining clients. The construction equipment was repossessed, and Leo was compelled to file for bankruptcy. But the most gratifying piece of news came from Julia, who had kept in touch with her contacts in the regional business community. "Your son applied for a job with Patterson Construction," she informed me over dinner at the cottage. Apparently, he presented himself as a seasoned contractor whose business had failed due to unforeseen family issues. Tom Patterson did some digging and uncovered the bankruptcy, the defaulted loans, and the reputation for subpar work. He also heard about a man who had been calling around town claiming his elderly father was missing and possibly incompetent. Julia paused to take a sip of her wine, clearly relishing the tale. Patterson told me he became suspicious of anyone who would publicly call into question his own father's mental state while simultaneously trying to get his hands on his assets. He decided Leo wasn't the type of person he wanted on his payroll. This same pattern unfolded at every construction company in the area. Leo's attempts to portray me as a confused old man had backfired spectacularly, branding him as someone who was fundamentally untrustworthy. Meanwhile, my own life had achieved a level of contentment I had never thought possible. Sarah and I had grown even closer, spending most of our days together without feeling the need to formally define our relationship. We were simply two people who enjoyed each other's company and chose to share our lives. "I never thought I would find this again," she confessed one evening as we watched the sunset from my deck. "Companionship with someone who doesn't expect me to be anything other than myself." I understood her sentiment completely. At 70, I had finally discovered what it felt like to be valued for who I was, rather than for what I could provide. My volunteer work had blossomed into several different areas. In addition to the literacy program and the animal shelter, I had started helping out at the community garden and had been appointed to the town council's committee on senior services. For the first time in my adult life, I was making contributions to my community in ways that nourished my soul instead of depleting my resources. 6 months after I left, Leo made his final, desperate move. He drove to Pine Ridge and began asking people around town for information about me. His timing could not have been worse. By that point, I was a familiar and well-regarded member of the community. Leo's inquiries about his confused elderly father were met with a wall of protective silence and mounting suspicion. Sarah was the first to encounter him at the grocery store, where Leo was asking the manager if he had seen an elderly man fitting my description. "I was just picking up ingredients for dinner when this man came up to me," Sarah told me that evening. He was thin, unshaven, had a desperate look about him. He started asking if I had seen his father. "Described you perfectly. Said you were likely confused and might not even remember your own name correctly." "What did you say to him?" Sarah smiled grimly. "I told him that if a 70-year-old man wanted to disappear from his family, he probably had very good reasons for it. I suggested that he might want to reflect on why someone would go to such great lengths to avoid him." Leo's reaction was predictable: anger, accusations that strangers were meddling in family matters, and demands to know my whereabouts. Sarah simply walked away, but not before making it clear that Tyler was not welcome to harass the local residents. Similar scenarios played out across Pine Ridge over the next 2 days. Tyler approached everyone from the bank manager to the postal clerk, becoming more and more agitated as no one would cooperate. His behavior grew so disruptive that the local police eventually asked him to leave town. That evening, my phone rang. Leo's number flashed on the screen, and after 6 months of silence, I chose to answer. "I found you," he said, without any preamble, his voice heavy with exhaustion and rage. "Did you? Because from what I've heard, you found a town full of people who believe you are a dangerous man trying to harm an elderly person. They don't understand. They understand perfectly. They see a middle-aged man so desperate to get to his father's money that he's willing to lie about his mental state and harass strangers for information." Leo was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was broken. "Dad, I've lost everything. The house, the business, my marriage. Chloe left last month. I'm living in a studio apartment and doing construction work for minimum wage. I need your help." For the first time in our conversation, I detected something that sounded like genuine humility in his voice. But it was 6 months too late. "Leo, you didn't lose everything. You threw it all away. You had a father who loved you enough to sacrifice his own security for your dreams. You had a wife who believed in your potential. You had opportunities and resources that most people only dream of. And you squandered every bit of it because you never learned to appreciate what you had. I can change. Can you? Because this conversation feels exactly like every other crisis you've ever had. You're not sorry for how you treated me. You're sorry that you're facing consequences." I took a deep breath, steeling myself to say the words I never imagined I would speak to my own son. "Leo, I forgive you for everything you've done, but forgiveness does not mean I am going to enable you any longer. You are 45 years old. It's time you learn to solve your own problems." I ended the call before he could reply, and for the first time since I had left, I cried, not out of sadness, but out of relief. The final cord that tethered me to my old life had finally been cut. Leo's downfall was complete. But more importantly, my transformation was finished. I was no longer Arthur the provider or Arthur the problem solver. I was simply Arthur, a man who had learned to value himself enough to walk away from those who did not. 7 months after my departure, Leo appeared at my cottage unannounced. I was in the garden, gathering tomatoes for the week's canning, when I heard a car door shut in my driveway. Through the pine trees, I saw a glimpse of a rusted sedan that had clearly seen better days. Sarah was inside preparing lunch, and I was thankful for her presence as Leo came around the side of the cottage. The man approaching me was a far cry from the confident businessman who had planned my exile from my own kitchen table. This version of Leo was gaunt. His clothes were cheap and wrinkled, and his face showed the signs of someone who had been drinking too much and sleeping too little. "Hello, Leo," I said calmly, continuing to pick my tomatoes. I had known this day would come, and I had spent months mentally preparing for it. "Dad," his voice caught on the word. "You look good." I did look good, and we both were aware of it. 7 months of peace, proper sleep, healthy meals, and genuine companionship had transformed me. At 70, I was likely in the best physical condition I had been in for a decade. Thank you. How did you find me? It took months, but I finally hired a better investigator, someone who specializes in finding people who don't want to be found. Leo stepped closer, and I could smell the desperation on him like old sweat. "We need to talk." "About what?" "About you coming home. About fixing this mess between us." I set down my basket of tomatoes and truly looked at my son. The entitled man who had discussed my disposal was gone, replaced by someone who seemed lost and afraid. I felt a complex wave of emotions: sadness for what he had become, anger for what he had put me through, and a surprising amount of pity. Leo, this isn't a mess. This is my life. The life I chose for myself after you made it abundantly clear what you believed my role should be. I was wrong. The words erupted from him with a desperate force. I was so wrong, Dad, about the nursing home, about everything. I never should have said those things. You're right. You shouldn't have. But more importantly, you shouldn't have even thought them. Leo ran his hands through his thinning hair, a habit I recognized from his childhood when he was frustrated with homework or chores. I know I messed up. I know I took advantage of your generosity, but I'm different now. I've learned my lesson. Have you? Or have you simply run out of other options? The question hung in the air between us. Leo's face flushed with anger. The same anger he used to display as a child when faced with the consequences of his actions. That's not fair. You're my father. You can't just abandon your family because you're angry about something I said. And there it was. The entitlement that had poisoned our relationship for decades. Even now, facing the complete ruin of his life, Leo still couldn't see me as anything more than a resource he felt he had a right to access. Leo, I did not abandon you. I finally stopped enabling you. There's a significant difference. Sarah appeared on the cottage's front porch, alerted by the sound of our raised voices. She remained silent, but her presence was a firm reminder that I was no longer alone. No longer without support or protection. Tyler noticed her instantly. Who's that? A friend? The word friend was laced with incredulous anger. You disappear for 7 months and now you have a girlfriend? What about Mom's memory? What about family loyalty? I felt my own anger begin to rise. Not the hot, impulsive anger of my youth, but the cold, controlled fury of a man who had been pushed beyond his limits. Don't you dare speak to me about loyalty. Don't you dare use your mother's memory to excuse your own selfishness. Eleanor would be ashamed of the man you've become. Leo recoiled as if I had struck him. That's a horrible thing to say. It's a true thing to say. Your mother worked herself to the bone building something meaningful, something that would provide for her family. You turned her legacy into a financial pit that nearly wiped out my retirement. You treated me like a personal ATM while planning to warehouse me in a facility once I had served my purpose. And now you have the audacity to be angry because I chose to live for myself instead of dying for you. I never asked you to die for me, didn't you? You asked me to work 24-hour shifts at 70 years old. You asked me to drain my savings and jeopardize my future to clean up your mistakes. You asked me to sacrifice my health, my dreams, and my dignity so that you could evade the consequences of your own poor choices. What did you think the final outcome would be? Leo was crying now, tears of frustration and self-pity rolling down his face. I need you, Dad. I can't do this by myself. You're not alone because you need to be. You're alone because you pushed away everyone who ever cared about you. Chloe, your friends, your business associates, they all left when they realized you couldn't be trusted. I picked up my basket of tomatoes and started toward the cottage, pausing beside him. And do you want to know the saddest part? The saddest part is that if you had shown me even a fraction of the respect you show to strangers, I would have helped you for the rest of my life. If you had valued me as a person instead of just a source of funds, I would have moved mountains to help you succeed. But you couldn't see beyond your own needs long enough to recognize what you were throwing away. Leo grabbed my arm, his grip desperate, surprisingly strong. Please, Dad, I'm begging you. I have nothing left. No money, no job, nowhere to live. If you don't help me, I'll end up on the street. I looked down at his hand on my arm. The same hand that had signed the papers to sell my house to finance his failures. The same hand that had withdrawn money from our joint account without asking. The same hand that had waved dismissively as he spoke of putting me in a nursing home, "Leo, let go of my arm." Something in my tone must have registered, because he released me instantly. "You're not going to end up on the street because I won't help you. You're going to end up on the street because you never learned how to help yourself. There is a difference." I walked toward the cottage, leaving him standing alone in my garden. "This isn't over," he shouted after me, his voice shrill with desperation. "You're still my father. You can't just walk away from your responsibilities." I turned back one last time. "Leo, I fulfilled my responsibilities as a father when I raised you to be an adult. Everything I did for you after that was an act of love, not an obligation. And you repaid that love with exploitation and disrespect? I am done." Sarah opened the cottage door as I approached, her expression serious but supportive. Behind me, I heard Leo's car door slam, and the engine coughed and struggled to life. By the time I reached the porch, he was gone. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, putting her arm around my shoulders. I considered it. Was I okay? I had just severed ties with my only child, likely for good. I had watched him drive away, fully aware that he might very well end up homeless and destitute. A year ago, that thought would have shattered me. Now, I felt something I had never before experienced in relation to Leo. Peace. "I'm okay," I said, and I meant it. I'm finally okay. The confrontation I had been dreading for months was finally over, and I had discovered something profound about myself. I was strong enough to love my son without destroying myself in the process. Leo thought he had found a confused old man he could guilt back into his old role. Instead, he found someone who had learned the crucial difference between love and enabling, between family and exploitation. The man who had worked 24-hour shifts to pay his son's bills was gone. In his place stood someone who understood that the greatest gift he could now give Leo was the opportunity to finally grow up, even if it was an opportunity he never chose to take. 2 years had passed since Leo's desperate visit to my cottage, and my life had found a rhythm of contentment I had never imagined was possible. Sarah and I had quietly married the previous spring in a small ceremony with our Pine Ridge friends, a celebration of companionship and mutual respect that was nothing like the desperate, youthful love of my first marriage. We had moved into Sarah's larger house by the lake, and I sold the cottage to a young family from the city looking to escape urban life. Watching them find the same peace there that I had felt like I was passing on a precious gift. My volunteer efforts had grown into a position as the coordinator for Pine Ridge's senior services, where I helped other older adults navigate the transition from being a full-time caregiver to becoming an independent person. The irony was not lost on me that I had discovered my true purpose in my 70s, after decades of believing my only value was in what I could sacrifice for others. Leo had made sporadic attempts to contact me over those 2 years. Birthday cards, the occasional email, Christmas presents that I returned unopened. Each attempt felt less like genuine contrition and more like a test to see if my resolve had softened. It had not. I had heard through mutual acquaintances that he had managed to stay off the streets by moving in with another woman. Then, one morning, I received a call from my lawyer, Marcus. "Arthur," he began, "I received an interesting call today. A woman identifying herself as Leo's partner. She's pregnant with his child, and was inquiring about any potential inheritance for the baby." "And what did you tell her, Marcus?" "I informed her, per your instructions, that your estate is entirely arranged within an irrevocable trust, and that Leo is not named as a beneficiary. I explained that there would be no inheritance, now or in the future." He relayed that the woman had become quite upset, mentioning that Leo had assured her his father was a wealthy man who would eventually come around. It seemed my son was still trying to build his life on a foundation of my assets. Assets he no longer had any claim to. He hadn't changed at all. That evening, as Sarah and I sat on our porch watching the loons on the lake, I felt a final, quiet sense of closure. Leo had a new life, a new family to potentially take advantage of. That was his story to write now. Mine was here, in this peaceful place, with a woman I respected in a community I cherished. Arthur's incredible journey from an invisible provider to an empowered man who finally chose himself shows that it's never too late to step away from people who take you for granted, even when they are your own family. Sometimes, the most loving act is to stop enabling destructive behavior and allow someone to face the full weight of their own choices. What are your thoughts on Arthur's transformation? Was his quiet revenge a justified act of self-preservation, or did he go too far? If Arthur's story struck a chord with you, if you've ever felt unseen or unappreciated by the people you love most, perhaps this story can serve as a reminder. Your story is important. Your value is not determined by what you can offer to others. And it is never too late to begin living for yourself.